ANDELF, Assyrian Empire. For 300 years, the ancient world had one rule: pay the Assyrians, or die. Not surrender, not negotiate, die. Their armies appeared at your walls and your choices were simple: open the gates, or watch them impale your soldiers on stakes outside your city, skin your nobles alive, and deport every man, woman, and child to the other end of the empire. This was not exaggeration. This was policy. The Assyrian Empire was the most powerful military force the ancient world had ever produced. And then, in less than 20 years, it was gone. Not weakened, not pushed back. Gone. This is how it ended. The Assyrians invented modern warfare. They were the first army in history to use iron weapons at scale, when every other army was still fighting with bronze. They built siege towers on wheels. They dug tunnels under city walls. They developed military logistics so advanced that an army of 50,000 men could operate thousands of kilometers from home. But their most powerful weapon was psychological. After conquering a city, they would publicly execute the leaders in the most brutal way possible and document it. Carvings, inscriptions, sent to every neighboring king as a message. This is what happens when you resist. It worked. For 300 years, it worked perfectly. By 700 BCE, the Assyrian Empire stretched from Egypt in the west to Persia in the east, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Their capital, Nineveh, sat on the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. It had a population of roughly 100,000 people, the largest city on Earth. Its walls stretched 12 kilometers around the city, standing 25 meters high. Inside those walls, palaces, temples, gardens, and the most sophisticated royal court the ancient world had seen. Every king from the Pharaoh of Egypt to the rulers of Babylon paid tribute. Caravans of gold, silver, horses, and slaves arrived in Nineveh every year. The empire seemed eternal. In 668 BCE, a new king took the throne. His name was Assurbanipal. He was the most powerful ruler Assyria had ever produced, and one of the most contradictory figures in ancient history. He personally led campaigns that sacked Thebes, the capital of Egypt. He destroyed the kingdom of Elam so completely that its language disappeared. He had rebels boiled alive and hung their heads from trees in his garden. But he was also a scholar. In his palace at Nineveh, Assurbanipal built the world's first great library, 30,000 clay tablets containing every text in the known world: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, mythology, law, including a text called the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest written story. But beneath the power, beneath the gold and the terror, the empire was already under enormous strain. The math was brutal. Every province conquered required troops to hold it. Every rebellion suppressed required campaigns that cost money and men. The empire had expanded so far, so fast, that it was permanently stretched. And there was something else. 300 years of mass deportations, public torture, and systematic destruction had created something the Assyrians hadn't planned for: a world full of people who would do anything to see them fall. They had conquered every nation around them. What they hadn't realized was that they had also turned every conquered nation into a future enemy. In 627 BCE, Assurbanipal died. He left behind the greatest empire on earth and no clear plan for who would rule it next. In any empire, a succession crisis is dangerous. In the Assyrian Empire, with its enemies watching from every direction, a succession crisis was fatal. The death of the last great king was the moment the entire ancient world had been waiting for. Some had been waiting for generations. Within months of Assurbanipal's death, 2 of his sons went to war with each other. Sinsharishkun controlled the heartland. His brother Sinshumlashur controlled Babylon. Both claimed the throne. Both raised armies. For 2 years, 627 to 625 BCE, the Assyrian military, the greatest fighting force in the ancient world, was busy killing itself. Troops that should have been holding the borders were instead fighting each other in Mesopotamia. The timing could not have been worse, because outside the borders, someone was watching and making his move. His name was Nabopolassar. He was a Chaldean tribal leader from southern Mesopotamia, a region the Assyrians had controlled for over a century. In 626 BCE, while Assyrian brothers were killing each other, Nabopolassar declared the city of Babylon independent. The Assyrians had suppressed Babylonian rebellions dozens of times before. They burned it down twice. They assumed they would crush this one too. They were wrong. Nabopolassar not only held Babylon, he started winning battles against Assyrian armies. He was a better general than anyone expected, and he had something the Assyrians didn't: the support of every Babylonian who had lived under Assyrian rule. To the east of Assyria, in the mountains of modern Iran, lived the Medes. The Assyrians had raided Median territory for generations, taking horses and slaves. The Medes had never been able to stop them. Their tribal structure was too fragmented to mount a serious defense. But after 625 BCE, their king Cyaxares did something remarkable. He reorganized the Median army on the Assyrian model: specialized infantry, cavalry, siege engineers. He drilled his soldiers in Assyrian tactics. He was, essentially, studying the playbook of the army he intended to destroy, quietly, patiently, while Assyria was distracted by its civil war. Around 614 BCE, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares did something unprecedented. They made a formal military alliance, and to seal it, Cyaxares' granddaughter married Nabopolassar's son, a prince named Nebuchadnezzar. The two greatest enemies of Assyria were now family. For the first time in history, Assyria faced a coordinated coalition of enemies, not rebellions in different directions, but a single combined force with a single objective: the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. And the empire, exhausted by civil war, could not stop what was coming. In 616 BCE, Nabopolassar stopped defending and went on attack. His armies crossed into Assyrian territory and won, then won again. The ancient world watched in disbelief. Babylonian armies beating Assyrian armies in open battle was something that simply wasn't supposed to happen. An Egyptian army marched north to help Assyria, because Egypt understood that a Babylonian victory would eventually threaten them too. But even with Egyptian reinforcements, the Assyrians couldn't push the Babylonians back. The tide had turned. In 614 BCE, the Medes made their first major strike. They didn't attack Nineveh. They attacked Ashur. Ashur was the oldest Assyrian city, older than Nineveh, older than the empire itself. It was the sacred city of the god Ashur, from whom the Assyrians took their name. It was the spiritual heart of their civilization. The Medes sacked it completely. By the time the Babylonian army arrived to help, it was over. Cyaxares and Nabopolassar met on the smoking ruins of Ashur and shook hands. Their alliance was sealed in the ashes of the city that had given Assyria its name. In 612 BCE, the coalition marched on Nineveh itself. The combined Medo-Babylonian army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, surrounded the greatest city on earth. The walls of Nineveh were extraordinary: 12 kilometers of fortification, 25 meters high, 15 city gates, each one a fortress in itself. The city had grain stores for years, water from the Tigris. The defenders knew that if they could hold long enough, the coalition would have to retreat, as every previous attacker had. The siege began. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. 3 months into the siege, the Tigris River flooded. This was not unusual for Mesopotamia. Spring floods were common. But this flood was catastrophic. The waters rose so high that sections of the Great Wall, built partly on river embankments, collapsed into the river. The gate of the rivers is opened, and the palace is dissolved. Those words come from the book of Nahum, a Hebrew prophet who had predicted exactly this. Written decades before it happened, the coalition forces poured through the collapsed walls. After 3 months of holding out, Nineveh fell in a matter of hours. The sack of Nineveh lasted days. The palaces were stripped of everything valuable. The temples were looted. The population was killed or enslaved. And then the city was burned. King Sin-Sharashkun, the man who had fought his brother for the throne and won, died in the burning city. Ancient sources disagree on whether he was killed in battle or burned himself alive in his palace rather than be captured. It didn't matter. The king was dead. The capital was Ash, the greatest city on earth. The city that had ruled the world for 3 centuries ceased to exist, and it would not be found again for 2,500 years. In Jerusalem, a prophet named Nahum had written about this moment years before it happened. His text is almost unlike anything else in the Bible. There is no sorrow, no call to repentance, no mercy, only celebration. Woe to the city of blood, full of plunder, never without victims. The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots. All this for a city that sold nations by her prostitution. For the Hebrews, who had been deported by the Assyrians, whose kings had been forced to pay tribute for generations. The fall of Nineveh was not a tragedy. It was justice, long overdue. Nahum was not alone in his reaction. Across the ancient Near East, nations that had lived under Assyrian domination for generations responded to the news of Nineveh's fall with something like joy. Tribute records were burned, hostages returned home. Local kings who had spent their reigns as Assyrian vassals suddenly found themselves free. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, noted that the speed of Assyria's fall astonished even those who witnessed it. An empire that had seemed permanent, that had defined the world for 300 years, had ceased to exist in a single generation. Here is the part of the story most people don't know. Egypt did not celebrate the fall of Nineveh. While every other nation rejoiced, Pharaoh Necho II was doing something. That seems almost impossible to understand. He was marching his army north through Canaan to save what remained of the Assyrian Empire. This was not sentiment. It was strategy. Egypt had learned to live with Assyria as a distant overlord. What Egypt feared was a strong, united Babylon right on its doorstep. Assyria as a weakened buffer state was useful. Assyria destroyed and replaced by Babylon was dangerous. So Necho marched north to rescue the people who had once enslaved his nation. In his path stood the kingdom of Judah and its king, Josiah. Josiah was one of the most celebrated kings in the Bible. He had reformed. Judah's religion found the lost book of the law and led his people back to their faith. He saw Necho's army marching north to save Assyria, and he tried to stop them. At the city of Megiddo, Josiah led his army against the Egyptian forces. He was killed in battle. The Bible treats this as a tragedy, a righteous king cut down at the moment of victory over Assyria. Necho, meanwhile, did not stop to grieve. He sent his condolences and continued north. With Nineveh gone, the surviving Assyrian forces had retreated northwest to a city called Haran, in what is now southern Turkey. There, a man named Ashur-uballit II declared himself king of Assyria. He controlled almost nothing. A few cities, a remnant army, Egyptian allies who needed him to survive as a political fiction. But he was alive, and as long as the last Assyrian king breathed, the empire technically existed. It was 610 BCE. The clock was running out. In 610 BCE, the Babylonian and Median armies marched on Haran. Ashur-uballit fled before they arrived, retreating west with his Egyptian allies, hoping to regroup and counterattack. The coalition took Haran without a major battle. The last city of the Assyrian Empire was gone. Ashur-uballit now controlled nothing. No city, no territory, no capital. He was a king of dust, commanding an army that existed on hope and Egyptian gold. But he wasn't finished yet. In 609 BCE, Ashur-uballit made his final move. With Egyptian reinforcements, soldiers sent by Pharaoh Necho, he launched an attack on Haran, hoping to retake the city and re-establish a base of operations. The attack failed completely. The coalition forces repelled the Assyrian-Egyptian army without difficulty. The counterattack that was supposed to restore the empire accomplished nothing. Necho's forces retreated south, back toward Egypt, and Ashur-uballit II, last king of the Assyrian Empire, retreated with them. And then he disappeared. After 609 BCE, there is no more record of Ashur-uballit II, no account of his death, no grave discovered, no inscription recording what happened to him. He simply walks out of history and never comes back. He was the king of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever built, and his end is unknown. Probably a refugee somewhere in Egypt or the Syrian desert, living out his days as a stateless man whose kingdom existed only in his memory. The Assyrian Empire ended not with a final battle, but with a king who vanished. In the decades after 609 BCE, something remarkable happened in northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrian heartland. The cities of Nineveh, Ashur, Nimrud, Khorsabad fell largely silent, not conquered and reorganized, not settled by new populations. Empty. The cities that had housed hundreds of thousands of people were abandoned. Fields went unfarmed. Trade routes that had operated for centuries fell quiet. An entire civilization had been not just defeated, but erased. It was as if someone had pressed a delete key on 3 centuries of history. Within 2 centuries of its fall, the location of Nineveh itself became uncertain. When the Greek historian Xenophon marched through the area in 400 BCE, less than 200 years after the city's destruction, he passed near the ruins without recognizing them. Local villagers couldn't tell him what city it had been. When Alexander the Great fought the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, just 20 kilometers from the ruins of Nineveh, the greatest city of the ancient world was already buried so completely under sand and grass that no one pointed to it. The Assyrian Empire had been so thoroughly erased that the world forgot where its capital had stood. To understand why Assyria fell so completely, you have to understand what made it different from every other ancient empire. Rome conquered nations and made them Romans. They built roads, gave citizenship, spread Latin culture. Conquered peoples slowly became part of Rome. Persia conquered nations and let them keep their religion, their language, their local rulers, as long as they paid taxes and served in the army. Assyria conquered nations and made them afraid. That was the entire strategy. Terror as government policy. Fear works until it stops working. And the moment it stopped working, there was nothing underneath. No loyalty, no shared identity, no reason for anyone to defend Assyria. The second reason was mathematics. The Assyrian Empire at its peak controlled territory from Egypt to Iran, a distance of over 3,000 kilometers. Holding that territory required armies stationed at every major city, every border crossing, every potential flashpoint. And every province that rebelled required a military response, pulling troops away from somewhere else. By the time Nabopolassar rose in Babylon, the Assyrian military was being stretched in too many directions simultaneously. There were never enough soldiers in one place to decisively defeat any single enemy, and there were multiple enemies attacking at once. The civil war of 627 to 625 BCE was the wound that killed the empire. Not because it killed soldiers, though it did, but because it revealed something every enemy of Assyria had been watching for, a crack in the armor. Before the civil war, attacking Assyria seemed suicidal. The empire appeared, solid, unified, invincible. The moment 2 Assyrian princes started fighting each other, every potential enemy recalibrated. The empire was not invincible. It was not even unified. It was vulnerable. Nabopolassar moved within months. Cyaxares reorganized his army. The coalition formed. All of it triggered by 2 brothers who couldn't share a throne. Compare Assyria to what came after it. Babylon, which replaced it, had something Assyria never built: cultural power. The Babylonians were the intellectual center of the ancient world. Their astronomy, their mathematics, their literature, their theology spread across the Near East regardless of political borders. When Babylon eventually fell to Persia, Babylonian culture survived and transformed Persian civilization. When Persia fell to Alexander, Greek and Persian culture merged into something new. Culture outlasts empires. Assyria had iron and terror. When the iron stopped winning, nothing remained. No culture to absorb into new empires, no ideas worth keeping, just ruins. The final reason was coordination. Throughout their history, the Assyrians had always faced enemies one at a time. Egypt fighting Assyria while Babylon was pacified. Babylon rebelling while Egypt was quiet. The Medes raiding while the West was stable. Divide and defeat, the cornerstone of Assyrian strategy. But the alliance of 614 BCE changed everything. For the first time, Babylon and the Medes attacked together, coordinated, simultaneous, with a shared plan. The Assyrian system had no answer for this. They couldn't shift troops east without weakening the south, couldn't reinforce the south without exposing the east. The empire was pulled apart at the seams. For all their brutality, the Assyrians built things that outlasted them by millennia. Their military innovations, siege engineering, cavalry tactics, military, logistics, intelligence networks, were copied directly by the Persian Empire, which was then copied by Alexander the Great, which fed into the Roman legions. The techniques that built the greatest military machine of the ancient world were preserved by the very civilizations that destroyed Assyria. Their road network, their postal system, their administrative structure. All of it became the template for empires that followed. The Assyrians were erased from history. Their innovations were not. And then there are the tablets. When Nineveh burned in 612 BCE, the flames were catastrophically hot enough to bake the clay tablets in Assurbanipal's library. The 30,000 texts that recorded everything from star charts to medical manuals to mythology. Clay that was sun-dried becomes soft in water. Clay that is kiln-fired becomes pottery, nearly indestructible. The fire that was supposed to destroy the library accidentally preserved it. In 1853 CE, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard excavated Nineveh and found tens of thousands of clay tablets, still readable, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written story in human history, preserved by the fire that burned the city it came from. No ancient empire is mentioned more in the Bible than Assyria. The books of Isaiah, Jonah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Kings, Chronicles, Assyria appears in all of them, as the rod of God's anger in Isaiah, as the city that repented in Jonah, as the object of divine wrath in Nahum. The Assyrians, through their brutality, shaped the theological worldview of the ancient Hebrews more profoundly than any other nation. The concept of divine judgment, of a great power being destroyed for its sins, is central to the Hebrew Bible, and it was the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE that gave that concept its most vivid historical example. Assyria shaped Western religion from the outside without intending to. Here is something almost no one knows. The Assyrian people still exist. Approximately 3 million people around the world. In Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and the diaspora identify as Assyrian. They are descendants of the ancient Assyrians converted to Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. They speak Neo-Aramaic, a modern form of Aramaic, the ancient language of the Near East that eventually replaced Akkadian as the common language of the Assyrian Empire. They have survived the fall of their ancient empire, the rise of Islam, the Ottoman massacres of the early 20th century, and the wars of the 21st century. The empire is gone. The people are not. For 2,000 years, the Assyrian Empire existed only in the Bible and in the works of Greek historians who had never seen its cities. Then, in 1845 CE, Austen Henry Layard began excavating a large mound near the city of Mosul in northern Iraq. What he found stopped the world. Palaces, throne rooms, carved reliefs of kings and battles and mythological creatures, winged bulls the size of houses, the Lamassu, guardians of Assyrian, gates, standing exactly where Assyrian craftsmen had placed them 2,500 years earlier. An entire civilization pulled from the earth. The Assyrian Empire was not a myth. It was real, and its ruins are still being excavated today. The first lesson of Assyria is the oldest lesson in politics. Power built on fear is temporary, because fear requires constant maintenance. Every generation needs to be re-terrified. Every rebellion needs to be suppressed. Every show of weakness invites challenge. This is exhausting, and eventually impossible. The Assyrians understood how to make people obedient. They never figured out how to make them loyal. And when the machinery of terror finally slowed, when the armies were stretched too thin, when the royal succession failed, when the enemies finally coordinated, there was nothing else holding the empire together. It didn't crack. It shattered. The second lesson is about how empires fall. We imagine decline as gradual, a slow erosion over centuries, visible to anyone paying attention. But the Assyrian Empire went from the most powerful state on earth to nothing in 20 years. Assurbanipal died in 627 BCE. By 609 BCE, the empire was completely gone. That is one generation. The children of people who paid tribute to thee, mightiest empire in the world, lived to see its capital buried in ash. Strength and permanence are not the same thing. An empire can look invincible, right up until the moment it isn't. The third lesson is about the enemies you create. Every atrocity the Assyrians committed was rational in the short term. Mass deportations prevented local rebellions. Public executions deterred resistance. Systematic destruction removed future threats. But each atrocity also created survivors, families who remembered, nations that nursed their grievances across generations. When the moment came, when Assyria was finally vulnerable, there was no shortage of people ready to destroy it. The Assyrians did not fall to strangers. They fell to the accumulated hatred of everyone they had ever conquered. 300 years of brutality, collected and returned. Here is what didn't survive the fall of Assyria: the kings, the armies, the palaces, the empire. Here is what did: the clay tablets, the stories, the astronomical calculations, the irrigation techniques, the military innovations, the people themselves. Assurbanipal spent his life conquering nations. His library, built almost as an afterthought, a vanity project for a warrior king who also happened to be a scholar, is why we know his name. The library outlasted the empire by 2,000 years. What you create with knowledge and culture outlasts what you build with fear. Somewhere in 609 BCE, the last king of Assyria walked away from the battlefield at Haran and disappeared. He had no city, no army worth the name, no future. His ancestors had ruled an empire of 3 million square kilometers. They had made Egypt kneel. They had deported Israel. They had burned and rebuilt Babylon 4 times, and it was gone. In northern Iraq today, archaeologists still dig at the mounds that cover the ruins of Nineveh, Ashur, Nimrud. They still find things no one knew existed. The empire that was erased from the earth is still giving up its secrets, 2,600 years after the fires that were supposed to end it. History does not forget. It only buries.